This man has been locked in an archaic machine for almost 60 years of his life. Texan Paul Alexander, age 70, was unlucky enough to fall victim to an appalling epidemic that raged across the US in 1952, poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio. And Alexander, age 6 at the time, was one of the small minority of those unfortunates who were affected by the poliovirus and then had to suffer lifelong disability as a result. Sadly, his impairment has meant a life sentence trapped horizontally inside a now archaic piece of medical apparatus called an iron lung. But, as we shall see, Alexander did not just lie down and accept his prognosis. New generations are lucky to have escaped many of the medical horrors that were all too commonplace in human history. Before medical science had accrued its current wealth of knowledge, there were many illnesses that doomed humankind to terrible consequences, from severe lifelong impediments through to death. And one of the most feared of these merciless diseases was polio, which had another name, infantile paralysis. Poliomyelitis only affects humans and is especially cruel in that it largely attacks very young children. Polio has been a scourge of the human race for millennia, and even ancient Egyptian art portrays its crippling effects. However, the ailment was not clinically defined until the 18th century, when British doctor Michael Underwood wrote a paper on childhood diseases. He described it as a debility of the lower extremities. However, in rare cases, poliomyelitis can also affect the head, neck, and diaphragm. But in fact, the vast majority of people who contract polio escape its worst effects. Unnervingly, some 70% of those who contract the disease actually experience no symptoms at all. This, alas, makes them unwitting carriers of the virus for an infection time of 6 weeks. Nevertheless, only as few as 1% of those infected will experience a weakening of the muscles, resulting in paralysis. This is when the poliovirus attacks the pathways of the central nervous system along the spine and in the brainstem. The virus reproduces itself in motoneurons, laying waste to them in the process. And tragically, of those children who succumb to polio, some 2 to 5% will die. Moreover, this figure rockets to 30% in affected adults. But in truth, the majority of people who contract polio will either have no symptoms or an illness from which they will recover. This, of course, is little comfort to those unlucky enough to suffer the worst effects of the poliovirus. They face a life of painful physical disruption. The weakening of the muscles can result in paralytic poliomyelitis, as the virus travels along the nerve superhighways, destroying motor neurons. In children like the 6-year-old Paul Alexander, only 1 in every 1,000 will develop paralysis. But for those who do, it's a terrible affliction. The poliovirus is largely passed on by the feces of those infected when the waste matter gets into the water supply of communal bathing areas. Drinking contaminated water is the most common method of infection, although spreading the disease via saliva is also possible. And as we've seen, those people who are infected but not affected, known as asymptomatic, can spread the virus for up to a month and a half, potentially wreaking devastation. Even now, there's no cure for polio, although treatments are available to diminish the terrible effects of the disease. Antibiotics can prevent infections resulting from the weakening of muscles. Modern drugs can lessen pain, and controlled diet and exercise can be helpful in ameliorating the worst effects of the condition. In some cases, surgery may help to improve performance in deformed muscle groups. Nonetheless, by far and away the most effective medical intervention is prevention, achieved through mass vaccination. The first vaccine to combat poliomyelitis was developed by Hilary Kroprowski, a Polish virologist working in America in 1948. His vaccine was taken orally and used a weakened form of the poliovirus to develop immunity in the patient's body. U.S. scientist Jonas Salk built on Kroprowski's work the following decade. At his lab in Pittsburgh University in 1952, Salk created a polio vaccine that could be administered by injection. After exhaustive testing on about 1 million subjects, including his own wife and 3 sons, Salk's vaccine was proclaimed to be safe in 1955. Things moved fast after this breakthrough, and in 1957 some 100 million doses of the vaccine had been sent out to medical centers all over the US. The fourth ever International Polio Conference held in Geneva that same year reported remarkably rare instances of adverse reactions from the medicine. This success was repeated around the world, and severe polio epidemics now occurred only where Salk's vaccine was not yet available. By the 1960s, mass vaccination had reduced the number of polio cases in the US to fewer than 100 per year, and by 1979 the disease was declared to be eliminated entirely in America. Once again, a similar story played out in most countries around the planet. In 2016, the World Health Organization put the global number of reported polio cases at a mere 37. But this medical success story sadly came too late for the 6-year-old Paul Alexander in 1952. In fact, that year saw the worst polio epidemic that the US ever suffered. There were some 52,000 cases reported across the states, with 3,145 fatalities. On top of that, 21,269 people were struck by mild to severe paralysis. Unfortunately, young Alexander found himself in the severe paralysis category. In a 2014 interview with a reporter from Health Day website, Alexander recalled a fateful summer day in his hometown in 1952. He said, "I remember it was really hot and raining, something that's sort of rare for Dallas in August, and my brother and I had been outside playing, running around and getting wet when the rain started." Alexander continued, "Our mother called for us to come in for dinner, and I remember her taking one look at me, hot and wet and feverish, and she cried out, 'Oh my God!' She ripped my clothes off and threw me onto her and my dad's bed and called the doctor. She knew right away that I had polio. I don't know how she knew, but she knew. I remember feeling hot and feverish, and for the next few days I stayed in bed and didn't move." Heartbreakingly, within 6 days, Alexander no longer had the ability to move at all. The boy was also in considerable pain and was struggling to breathe. He told Health Day, "I'd become immobile. I don't think I could even talk. So the hospital staff put me on a gurney in a long hallway with all the other hopeless polio kids. Most of them were dead." Alexander remembered that he blacked out, and when the boy came to after weeks had passed, he was in an iron lung. This is a machine that helps those with paralysis of the lungs to breathe by making the lungs fill and then exhale by applying pressure. The patient would lie on their back in an airtight drum with the body enclosed and their head poking out. Pumps would then vary air pressure within the cylinder, forcing the occupant to breathe. For many more fortunate polio victims with milder symptoms, the device was used for only a couple of weeks or so until recovery. For Alexander, however, the iron lung was an unwieldy piece of apparatus that he would have to depend on for the rest of his life. Today, only Alexander and less than a handful of others in the US still need to use an iron lung to stay alive. That means that Alexander has been dependent on this now archaic piece of machinery for more than 60 years. But he hasn't allowed that fact to put a stop to his life. Helped by scholarships, Alexander graduated from the Southern Methodist University in Dallas and then gained a law degree from the University of Texas in Austin. Subsequently, Alexander became an attorney and set up his own practice. To achieve all that educational and professional success, Alexander effectively had to relearn how to breathe first in order to temporarily leave the confines of the iron lung. He explained to Health Day, "I have to consciously push air into my lungs, something that's done involuntarily by just about everyone else. It's hard work, but it allows me to escape this infernal device, if only for a little while." But as Alexander grew older, he became even more dependent on the machine. Moreover, his biggest problem now is age, and it's not just the fact that he's advancing in years. The iron lung is now virtually a museum piece, and sourcing spare parts and organizing maintenance are a real problem. In 2015, a friend posted a video of Alexander in his antiquated life support machine to YouTube. In the clip, the attorney explained the difficulties he was having in keeping his machine going. Luckily, a good Samaritan called Brady Richards came across the uploaded film. Richards runs an equipment testing facility to see how various products stand up to environmental factors. In his spare time, he repairs and reconditions racing cars, hot rods, and, bizarrely, iron lungs. Richards has become Alexander's savior, and the latter said, "It's a miracle that I found him." And asked how he coped in the last 60 years and more, Alexander answered succinctly and with optimism. "It all starts with love," he told Health Day. "My parents raised me in love. They taught me never to give up. And you know what? They were right. Anything's possible." Check out these other videos from Let Me Know. If you haven't made the move to subscribe to our channel, all you need to do is click on that red subscribe button. Thank you for watching.